You write for The Guardian, for Rock Paper Shotgun, for Unwinnable. I will stop the list now, but a lot of things. And you recently leave UK to fly all around the world and do your own job, freelance and meeting people. And okay, so now we will leave you the microphone and let's start.
Okay. Thank you, Simon. Actually, it's kind of weird because thank you. I could do it without, if you like. It would be better with pictures, probably, I think.
You need to send me the Google Doc.
Okay. I'll do that. Hang on. This is just because MacBooks are awful at presentations. And
But I don't have your presentation yet.
it's okay. I can log in from your computer.
Okay. Oh, wow.
So it's kind of interesting because actually Simon was kind of the beginning of my sort of world traveling project, because I went to Paris and I was really surprised by the culture that I found there, and video games were inhabiting museums in Paris, and I was really kind of shocked by that. But there didn't seem to be much in the way of, I guess, independent sort of games culture like there was in London. So it was very different from the way things work in London. And so I wrote this whole thing I put it on Medium eventually, because no one wanted to publish it. So I published it myself. And it was basically about when I went to Paris and I saw the differences between London and Paris and how they regarded independent game making. And I actually ended up emailing Simon about Paris and asking him lots of questions about it. That was kind of the beginning of me thinking, well, wouldn't it be interesting if I went around the world and asked people how they thought about games instead of actually like a 10-minute press junket asking them questions about the game that they'd made already? Why didn't I ask them about how they regarded actually making games? Culturally speaking, like what's their environment, what made them want to make games in the first place, how they thought about games, where they got the inspiration from. But essentially, it would be easier if I just went to visit them and stayed with them and see like what their life is like. And so that was kind of the inspiration for the whole thing. So if you want to look that up, it's on Medium under Paris, London. I think it called it something like a video game adventure or something, which sounds really overdramatic. Anyway, this is really nice, so hopefully this will work. There we go. It should come up now. So I guess I'll get started. Is anyone familiar with my work in the room? Raise your hand if you're sort of familiar. Okay, that's not too bad. So that's a good ego boost. What I do is I mainly just write about the culture surrounding games. I'm more interested in people than I am games. I'm interested in the people who make games. I'm interested in why people make games. I'm interested in the ideas expressed through games. I'm more interested in them as a kind of I guess a conversation or a mode of expression. I have sort of insinuated myself into places like The Guardian and Rock Paper Shotgun, and I do try to do unusual things with writing instead of just doing the normal games journalism. Like there's actually like a standard thing that you do, which I guess is kind of exemplified by IGN coverage of games, which is essentially like previews, reviews, features, news, that sort of thing. And most of my stuff, unhappily, doesn't actually really fit into much of that. I'd rather just talk about games in a kind of silly way. So anyway, I will get started now. Our slides are ready. So I want to talk today about how I actually came to embark on this sort of traveling games journalism thing, because it's actually funded primarily by people who read my work rather than people who actually commission me, which is kind of interesting. So anyway, so the old gods are dying. I used to fall asleep on the UK Games magazine PC Zone, which you see behind me there, when I was 11 years old, which at the time, which I didn't really know that much about video games, except I liked playing Lemmings on my next door neighbor's NES. Or do you call it an NES? An NES or something? I got in trouble in America because I called it a NES, and they say NES there. So anyway, So I loved reading that magazine. I just liked the stories and the jokes and the worlds it described. I liked the writing. It was sarcastic and very loving. And I didn't know I would end up writing about video games for a living when I trawled Charlie Brooker's prose, and that's Charlie Brooker right there, for his turns of phrase. But because of that magazine, I started to think that games were fascinating. I started to boot up PCs and install the games that the voices of PC Zone evangelized and made fun of. And everything in PC Zone read like the writers were having a passionate love affair with a medium that they also thought was ridiculous, bourgeois, and funny. They made them sound really exciting. They were angry young men who wanted everything to be better and were entertaining and even muscle-achingly funny about resenting the profundity of feeling that they felt towards games. And some of this attitude bled into sites like Old Man Murray, and leaked into Insert Credit, and perhaps it's also somewhat preserved in Rock, Paper, Shotgun. But yet PC Zone died in 2010, leaving the knob jokes to Old Man Murray, and a lot of games journalists unemployed. But something else is being born, and it needs an audience to survive. So currently there are 3 main ways for individual games journalists to become visible and attain an audience. So the first is being employed by large-scale specialist games press. So this includes print magazines like PC Gamer and Edge that are expensive to produce, and so they'll probably slowly migrate to being online properties. And Game Developer Magazine recently ended its run though Gamma Sutra still sort of performs a similar online function. And there's Kotaku and Polygon and Joystick and GameSpot and Games Radar and all sorts of other sites that begin with game. These sites sort of subsist on news writing, which brings in the readers but also takes up a lot of staff writers' time. So newness is how they survive. They survive on the news turn, basically. The quick turnover of games information is necessary to bring in all the readers, but often doesn't reflect the pace at which people actually consume games, which is a slower, more contemplative one than is reflected in the huge volume of output. So I guess this is something that Kieran Gillen brought up when he wrote his infamous New Games Journalism post, which I don't know how many people have actually read this. Seeing as it's probably not that important to people who read about games, but people who write about games obviously kind of know about this piece of writing. It was basically a kind of manifesto about how people should be writing about games that Kieran wrote down when he was drunk or something, and basically he just said we should be writing about games for people who maybe a year from now are going to pick up a game that came out, it's new now, but what about in the future? Why aren't we writing about games that people have in their house already, instead of trying to evangelize a new game that's just come out? And we forget about games, 5 minutes after they've come out. Why do we do that? We're not serving our readers, and that's the thing that I got from this piece of writing. That's what I liked about it. And I think he's right. But there's the smaller games blogs, so sites that produce usually only sort of quality, in-depth articles, but are much less likely to turn a profit because of their subsistence on those long-form essays, which are much more interesting, I think. Sites like Unwinnable, which I've also written for, Medium Difficulty, Insert Credit, Border House, Hit Self-Destruct, Midnight Resistance, and a number of places like Old Man Murray and Nightmare Mode, which have sadly since stopped updating. But these places are all excellent places for games criticism. Please, definitely, if you haven't heard of them already, go and check them out. They're wonderful. I'll try and put the text for this online as well, so you can check this out afterwards. But yeah, so these places are all excellent places for games criticism, but without that daily churn of the news run, they don't draw as big a readership as the larger sites. However, some of the best games criticism over the years has come from them. And if you write there for long enough, you can become a cult writer in your own right. So people will search for your name and they'll check you out and they'll regard your opinion as being somewhat more interesting and more nuanced. The third way, okay, so I like to call this the, that's Old Man Murray. The Bogost Parkin continuum. So this is Ian Bogost. who is a well-known thinker about video games and writer. And then there's Simon Parkin, who used to be my boss at Little Loud, but sadly Little Loud is closed down. Sticks and Stones is out now, by the way. Anyway, so I refuse to sort of look up the word continuum, so I don't really know if it's appropriate. But this is when critics have a sensibility in their criticism that translates very well to the mainstream press. And so writing about games in the mainstream press becomes possible for those writers. So Ian Bogost, he writes for The Atlantic. I think he's just got like a full-time position there. And Simon does freelance for The New Yorker, which is like, I don't know if you've heard of The New Yorker. It's like this like small publication. And yeah, so they write about video games for really big outlets, which is kind of awesome, a bit of a sweet deal. I haven't really pitched them yet because I'm too scared because I make knob jokes. So anyway, the biggest problem for me was that most of the writing that reflects the way I feel about games exists in the smaller games blogs like Unwinnable, which is here, because they will take a risk on publishing unusual or personal content. So a year and a half ago, I thought, though I was broke and was temping for money, what I ended up doing was to do a lot of work for free, just to get an audience who knew about my work and wanted to reflect on it and discuss it with me. So I continually wrote the things I felt like I was gouging out of my soul because I wasn't seeing the kind of honesty I wanted about games or the conversations with developers that I wanted to read. I worked my ass off for it. I worked and people wanted to read what I wrote, and I'm very proud of the work that I did on Unwinnable. In fact, it gave me enough confidence that I eventually pitched my weird stuff to Rock, Paper, Shotgun, and then they didn't hate it, and then it kickstarted my career in the regular games press. So I maintain a weird column about sex and relationship games at Rock, Paper, Shotgun right now. That's one I wrote on Tale of Tales Fatale. And I couldn't be more grateful to them for paying me regularly for the odd things that come out of my brain. However, full-time freelance games critics can't afford to just write features for a living, particularly not the off-piece sort of shit I do, and not at the rates that are available. So you either need a salary from a publication in some form, such as an editor-at-large position like Hez McDonald did for IGN UK, or you can start writing the sort of articles that larger games sites want. So these include interviews, previews, reviews, and doing runs of news writing. Basically, in HBO's The Wire terms, you have to do the shit work before you get to do what you want. And even that requires flexibility in time. So for many games critics to even survive, they eventually had to do a news writing position that enabled them to earn the right to produce features, although plenty of excellent journalists are innate newsies who kind of just want to stay writing news forever. And even those news gigs are kind of few. However, I'm a stubborn SOB, and I really dislike writing news posts. So I also haven't yet psyched myself up to pitch those mainstream press to do the higher paying features. So to supplement my income, I wrote reviews for The Guardian, Eurogamer, Rock, Paper, Shotgun, and occasionally I did interviews with Steve Gaynor, where I made him pretend to be a papier-mâché duck, basically. I said, Steve, can you pretend to be the Christmas duck from your game? I sent him an email, and I said, could you pretend to be a duck for this interview? And he said, okay, go on then. And so he answered pretty much all of my questions. I like sitting. I'm Christmas duck. So it wasn't very useful in the end, but IGN published it, so it's fine. There's another really cruel joke to be made there, but I won't make it. But there still weren't enough hours in the day for me to make rent doing just this. I mean, it's great that IGN paid me to do the stupid interview about the Christmas duck, but it's still not that very much money. And I still felt like there was something more in between the cracks of what was already being reported that wasn't really being said. And I had racked up an audience of 10,000 people on Twitter from just writing across these platforms. So it was frustrating to think that people thought I'd made it. And they say this all to me, like all the time. They'd be like, oh, you've made it as a writer. But I was barely making £500 rent each month. I couldn't really afford my rent. So then I heard about this thing. Oh, this is not, you can't really see very well, but never mind. So this is Patreon. So Patreon is a subscription service where people can pledge $1 upwards towards each individual creator's writing per month. So my friend and excellent critic AVB already had one of these to fund her criticism, and she told me she thought I'd benefit from it. So I set up a Patreon to fund my extra writing each month. I kind of put it up, I mean, it was accidentally, okay, so basically I was pretty tipsy when I put it up. I was kind of a bit drunk, to be honest. And I'd always said to people on Twitter, you know what I'd really like to do? I'd just like to travel around the world and talk to people about games and like what they thought about games and their own games and how they create them and why and these sort of things. And it's bound to be different across every kind of like place because there's different economic conditions and there's different living conditions and there's different cultural stuff going on. And, you know, wouldn't it be great? And everyone on Twitter is always like, yeah, that would be great, Cara. Yeah, leave home. It'll be great. So anyway, I got drunk and put this up, and then I said, okay, if I get to $1,000, I'll give up my house and go around the world. and then within an hour, it was about $1,000, and I was like, oh my God, what have I done? I was still drunk, so it was fine, you know, but I was kind of like, wow, okay, that was a stupid idea. So anyway, 2 months later, I left my house. But I wanted to fund the kind of criticism that was slipping through the cracks, like the kind of stuff that I wanted to write, you know, like the kind that people wanted to read. And they did want to read it because they were pledging money towards it. There were definitely people who wanted, there are about 400 people right now who really want to read the stuff I write, which is amazing. Like, isn't that amazing? That's super awesome. And I think, you know, I was super grateful to them for doing that because, you know, it is the most interesting thing I've ever done. But I knew that they wanted to read the unusual stuff because I'd already done it on my own time, and it sort of looked a bit like this, which is what I talked about before, which is what I asked Simon about, and he told me I was being really silly about Paris. So anyway, so I wanted to treat games developers like they were creators and not machines for content, which is often what journalists they don't have enough time to consider the person who made the game. They just have enough time to ask you, where'd you get your inspiration from? Like, how many hours, how many levels are there? How many graphics are there? What have you done? Why are you doing this? What's this? What are the controls? You know, like how many lives do you have? Like that's what we have time for, because we've got like 30 minutes. We're supposed to ask something that our readers would want to know. And, you know, depending on where you write for, those are the questions, right? But I didn't really want to do that anymore. I wanted to treat the people who make the stuff we love with respect. And I wanted to ask them about their lifestyles and cultural backgrounds and their problems and their politics. I wanted to have conversations with them that weren't just the pragmatic interviews I was usually forced to do that lasted 30 minutes and felt like pulling teeth or like press junket ravens picking at a body. So I wanted to have games developers become human beings that the internet couldn't possibly hold at arm's length anymore. Because there's this stereotype that we're all shy and we're not very charismatic and we don't want to talk to anyone and we aren't all different, and we are all different, and it's much more interesting if you treat people like that. So in order to actually be able to afford to spend that time and to travel, I needed some sort of funding, and it turned out that the internet wanted that writing to the tune of eventually about $2,000 a month. So I guess here I am, in Berlin, starting that project. So the amount of money is something that I'm still kind of baffled about and very grateful for, but it's for something that I know that I like doing. And it's something that I'm really passionate about. And all the traditional forms of games media can't afford to pay me to do this. Even the days of sort of embedded rock journalism are largely over. Like, no one really does that anymore. So in the end, I don't expect that Patreon will become the best mode of funding for authors. It might be, it might not, but it's certainly not fixed for the structures that are already in place. But what it does do is allow for new writing to appear and be sustainable to a point. And that will serve as an inspiration for other pieces of writing about games that are new and interesting. So perhaps it'll even serve as evidence that there's a readership that the traditional models are not serving, and it will eventually change to accommodate. So hopefully in years when I'm no longer relevant, some kid will say they fell asleep on their keyboard reading about my stupid adventures and become interested in games, and will start to write something that's not quite the same as before. And I think that's a good enough offering to the old gods, as far as I'm concerned. Thank you very much.